This episode is brought to you by Nespresso. Gift magical mornings with Nespresso Virtuo Pop. Compact and stylish, Virtuo Pop is made to meet every morning coffee craving. From espresso to coffee, hot or iced, at the click of a button. And celebrate the season with Nespresso's limited edition coffee flavors. Sweet almond and hibiscus, cinnamon and candied tamarind, and festive double espresso. Magic in the making. Shop the holiday gift collection exclusively at Nespresso.com.
Big news. Sephora is now on Uber Eats. So if you find yourself facing a beauty emergency, like needing a last-minute gift, or you're just out of your favorite mascara, again, don't panic. We got you. Order now and get $10 off on Sephora orders of $50 or more on the Uber Eats app. Order now. Offer ends October 30th. One order per customer. Additional terms apply. See app for availability. Delivery fees may apply.
This is Fortune's Wheel, a podcast history of the late Middle Ages, and I'm Jonathan. Your time is your greatest currency, make no mistake, and this fact of life does not go unnoticed by the creators on whom you spend your time. So thank you for spending your time listening and learning along with me on this podcast. This series is entitled The Book of Alexios, and it puts Alexios Komnenos, Emperor of Eastern Rome, in the spotlight. There were few figures in the Middle Ages who held so much power and influence than him. And in this episode, we see his next challenge after the death of the Guiscard. The work of an emperor is never really finished, and a restful weekend is only an interlude before the next crisis, especially when you're threatened from horse riders in the southeast and horse riders in the north. This is Patreon episode 28, entitled The Book of Alexios, Chapter 9, The Pecheneg Problem. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Constantinople had no drought of astrologers, soothsayers, oracles, and self-stylized prophets in the last days of the 11th century. One such man was named Seth. Seth wrote down his prophecy and gave it to a number of Emperor Alexios' closest friends and advisors. The letters were sealed with wax. When word came that Robert Guiscard had died, Seth reappeared in the palace and told them all to open the letters. Anna Komnene writes, quote, "The oracle ran thus: a great enemy from the west who has caused much trouble will die suddenly." End quote. And I found it interesting that right there in the middle of her narrative of her father's life, Anna decides to veer away from the narrative and talk about divination. Seriously, she writes, quote, "For a brief moment, let us leave the main narrative for a short digression on the nature of oracles." End quote. Now, immediately following this, we see that good old-fashioned Byzantine pride, certainly a carryover from their Greek forebears, who once thought there was also no civilization as grand as it. Anna claims that prophecy simply didn't exist before, saying unequivocally, quote, "The art of divination is a rather recent discovery, unknown to the ancient world." End quote. Now, she lists ancient thinkers, like the famous astronomer Eudoxius, the philosopher Plato, and the astrologer Manetho, writing that these men, quote-unquote, had no accurate information on the subject. But these men did add to the science, as she calls it, in that they documented the observance of the stars at one's birth, among other things, quote, that are intelligible to the devotees of such nonsense, end quote. And therein we find her opinions on the matter of divination and prophecy made pretty clear. But she admits that she, quote-unquote, dabbled a little in the art, not in order to make use of such knowledge, heaven forbid, but so that being better informed about its futile jargon, I might confound the experts, end quote. She, along with those at the highest positions in Alexios' court, were both acutely aware of the growing practice of divination, and also its dangerous qualities. Now, Anna outright dismisses the practice, though she does use the word science, which I find interesting. Her father, however, just plain hated it. Divination, astrology, all of it. He hated it. She writes that during his reign, Constantinople was a beacon of the sciences. She writes, quote, "He honored philosophers and philosophy itself," end quote. But again, when it came to fortune-telling, he was rather hostile toward it. In fact, he had, in her words, waged a war against such occult practices. And yet, there were astrologers and diviners galore in Constantinople during the late 11th century, during his very reign. A certain Eleutherios, an Egyptian like the previously mentioned Seth, was a rather trustworthy diviner. An Athenian came to Constantinople during this time as well. His name was Pechenegs, and he had dreams of being the greatest of all soothsayers. When asked about when the emperor would die, Pechenegs was reported to have said a specific date. And when that date came, well, the emperor didn't die. In fact, a lion that lived inside the palaces, yes, an actual lion. The lion is the thing that died on that date. So, not quite the emperor, but a fierce creature all the same, I suppose. When asked again, he gave another date of the emperor's death. And when that date came, the unexpected death of Alexius's mother, Anna Delicini, actually occurred, which sent shockwaves through the capital. Maybe it was a part of Alexius that died when his mother died. I'm sure that's how he probably spun it. For what it's worth, Alexius kept Pechenegs around and didn't banish him. But that was more to save face than anything else. Just because he hated, divining and divination doesn't mean that the rest of Constantinople did as well. I find it quite interesting that in such a civilized and structured society as the Byzantine one, humans still tend to their superstitions. Even today, they still cling to the unknown and the mysteries of life. Like I said, we do the same today. Anyone paying attention to the UAPs in New Jersey, the strange fog in Florida, the explosion of ghost hunting and paranormal channels on YouTube, we're an interesting creature, that's for sure. And we may be 1,000 years distant from Anna Komnene, but so much is still the same. But Seth was apparently correct in his divination of a major threat in the West falling off this mortal coil. Anna writes of Robert Guiscard, quote unquote, "It was generally agreed, and some actually said, that Robert was an exceptional leader, quick-witted, a fine appearance, courteous, a clever conversationalist with a loud voice, accessible, of solid build, with hair invariably of the right length and a thick beard. He was always careful to observe the customs of his own race. He preserved to the end the youthful bloom which distinguished his face, and indeed his whole body, and was proud of it. He had the physique of a true leader. He treated with respect all his subjects, especially those who had served him with unswerving loyalty." And she would later write, quote, "The truth is that Robert's manliness, his marvelous skill in war, and his steadfast spirit are universally recognized," end quote. What Guiscard's death also did was deliver the empire a brief period of respite, which is why Emperor Alexius wasted no time in celebrating the Roman victory and engaging with an old ally, the Venetians. As we've said on the public podcast already, this was also the time of Anna Komnene's own birth. The time of Robert Guiscard's death was mere weeks before she was born. So when the emperor arrived back in Constantinople, not only was he greeted by an adoring city, but was also just able to make the birth of his newborn baby girl. The pomp and the circumstance was almost too much for the city, a city that could have really used some positivity in those days. Keep in mind, Manzikert was only 15 or so years earlier. The grand procession to the Forum of Constantinople, and then on to the even grander Hagia Sophia, Alexius showered his subjects with what they craved more than anything else: a hero. He was that hero. And that hero had a new princess to show off as well. Officers were rewarded, titles were granted, wealth and treasures were spread around very generously. The army itself was lifted up on the proverbial Roman shoulders and praised in all the bars and brothels inside Constantinople's towering walls, and as well as some outside. Senators bowed and prostrated themselves, and bishops and priests gave their blessings. The streets were filled with roaring crowds as sedan after sedan carried the important people of the empire to and fro. Donations were divvied out to various charities and churches around the city and in the surrounding towns. The imperial court spared nothing to celebrate the death of the empire's most dangerous enemy in nearly a generation. When you hear or read that the death of Robert Guiscard sent ripples across the Mediterranean region, no more true was it than in Constantinople. The Roman people were beyond afraid of a dirty, unsophisticated Frankish animal being their emperor. Sure, Alexius Comnenus had his enemies in and out of court. What emperor didn't, really? But he was Roman through and through. Again, to use a dismissive epithet of Annas and other Byzantine chroniclers of the time, Guiscard was a Celt. Think of a racially charged epithet today, and you get the idea. Being a Celt to the Byzantines, it wasn't really a good thing in Eastern Rome. Now that said, you'll soon see when we reference chroniclers' writing of the First Crusade, if there was one thread that Romans have really always appreciated and admired, a thread that connected the likes of Alexius Comnenus to Caesar Augustus, which to those living in Constantinople was without question one continuous thread. Well, they really, really liked the warrior spirit. Romans have always loved heroes, and the Greeks before them as well. They've always loved swashbuckling tales and battles and the virtues on display during war and other feats of daring. Robert Guiscard, he was the Byzantines' Hannibal, and they may have feared him and looked down upon his sophistication, but they simultaneously loved and admired such a worthy adversary, which makes their Alexius Comnenus that much greater a figure to them. Alexius would forevermore be the man who defeated the likes of Robert Guiscard. Well, we know the truth of it, don't we? But sometimes the story of the truth is far more important in national morale than the truth that is sitting behind it. Guiscard was great because he was defeated by their great emperor. And that's one way to look at it anyway. Now here on this podcast, it's pretty clear that Guiscard was great all on his own, but that would have hardly mattered to someone welcoming his emperor home from campaign. Now, before we move on to the meat of this episode, it's worth noting here that in the hubbub of celebrating the victory over the Normans, Alexius Comnenus was also working diligently hammering out a renewed deal with the Venetians, which would further increase the Venetian grip on maritime trade east of Italy. But now it included an expanded quarter within the city of Constantinople itself from which to run its enterprise. Venice was setting up franchises at this point. Now, with a capital linking Europe to Constantinople and a secondary base of operations within Constantinople itself, from which to expand even further eastward, Venice was quickly gaining a foothold in every major trade route and port city, again, east of Italy. And it's good to know that this included as far south as Fatimid Egypt due to Alexius's renewal of a long-lost trade of silk between the two cities of Constantinople and Cairo. Venice was uniquely positioned to run the entirety of Eastern Mediterranean trade, and Alexius was willing to give it up if it meant he had access to Venetian ships when he needed them. This freed up the coffers to focus on land-based operations instead of splitting them between army and navy. On the surface, Venice seemed to be the big winners here, and I do believe they were, especially given what's going to happen over the next 300 years because of what's happening right now. But I still maintain that this was a masterstroke in leadership by Alexius Comnenus, allowing him to reprioritize his strained funds under immense pressures from his north, his west, and his south. Turks, Pechenegs, Normans, these are enemies that they just didn't go away, and he needed to refocus his efforts where they were needed the most. Things were relatively calm in the capital during the years between 1085, again when Guiscard died, and 1088, the year that war came once again to Alexius's court. And during that time, as a baby became a precocious, father-adoring little girl, the imperial crown welcomed another baby into the world. Little Anna saw another daughter born. and she saw even another daughter born. Now, these two girls are most likely Maria Komnene, who would go on to marry Gregory Gabras, a member of another prominent Byzantine family, and Eudokia Komnene, who we know next to nothing about, really, just to be honest. In fact, there would be one more daughter born after 1090 named Theodora Komnene, who, like Eudokia, we know very, very little about. Truth be told, we don't know exactly how many children Alexios and Irene Dukaina had, but of their brood, there are 3 who played important roles historically, and of those 3, 2 of them play massive roles in Byzantine history. As you can guess, one of those is their eldest, a daughter, Anna, who would go on to write the epic biography I've quoted from countless times on this series, called the Alexiad. She was a powerhouse of an intellect and influence, and her marriage to one of Alexius's most trusted generals was a boon to the family beyond measure. However, on September 13th, 1087, just 4 days after William the Conqueror passed away in Rouen, on September 13th, Alexios and Irene were gifted their only son. Well, that we know of. And given the importance of sons 1,000 years ago, something tells me that if they had more sons, we'd know about them. That day, John Komnenos came into the world, taking the name of his paternal grandfather, John, who was instrumental in his great-uncle's rise to the imperial crown a half-century earlier. Anna herself writes of John's birth, quote, "Thus in the 11th indiction a boy was born to them, an event immediately followed by a great rejoicing. Not a trace of disappointment remained now that their desire was fulfilled. The entire people, seeing the pleasure of their rulers, made merry. Everyone was pleased, and all together were glad. The palace, then, was a place of perfect happiness, all sorrow and worries of all kinds banished, for their supporters showed a genuine heartfelt pleasure, and the rest pretended to share their joy." End quote. She goes on to offer a little description of John, which I'd like to share as well. But can we just stop and maybe appreciate the bitterness? If you need to, go back and listen to it again. To me, there is quite a bit of bitterness, and that's something to keep in mind for what happens later in life. Anyway, her little description of John, quote, "The little boy was of a swarthy complexion, with a broad forehead, rather thin cheeks, a nose that was neither fat nor aquiline, but something between the two, and darkish eyes which, as far as one can divine from the appearance of a newborn baby, gave evidence of a lively spirit." And it's in this same paragraph that she says that Alexios and Irene almost immediately elevated the baby John to the rank of emperor. A huge event was held in the Hagia Sophia and outside of it as well, complete with grand processions and various festivities around the city celebrating the heir's instant rise to the throne. John Komnene was baptized and crowned in the same day. So, with the family working itself out nicely and the capital all rejoicing in the diminished likelihood of a succession crisis, word came from outside Constantinople that things were beginning to collapse out in the Balkans and southeast Anatolia, both directions. It was a decent few years for the emperor, who was able to rest and recuperate after years of fighting the mighty Normans, but it was now time for Alexios to hit the fields and mountains once again. But this time, it wouldn't be against those pesky French pony boys. The Romans called them Scythians, still in those days. Though we know the Scythians were in reality a group of people from the Central Asian steppes centuries earlier, and had since splintered off into various other groups, including the Pechenegs, the Manichaeans, and the Bulgars, among others. There's also the Huns thrown in there as well earlier. The Pechenegs specifically were the on-again, off-again allies and enemies of the Eastern Romans, and in 1087 they chose to be enemies, but only out of necessity. They were not waging some war of conquest against Constantinople. Well, at least not at the beginning. It seems that they had suffered greatly at the warlike ambitions of their neighbors, the Sarmatians, and the raids were increasing in frequency to the point that they could no longer hold their own. The Pechenegs were forced to move south, down the Danube River, which led them directly into Roman territory in the mountains of northern Greece. Near the hilltop fortress of Beliatoba, the Manichaean leader, Troulus, hatched a plot to attack eastern Rome, as the pressures from their enemies to the north and east were becoming too much for them. They needed new areas to live in, but everywhere left to them was Roman. He called in the Pechenegs, who then took up the mantle to invade eastern Rome and help out the migration. From here, around mid-1087, we see Alexius once again prepping the empire for war against the Pechenegs and the Manichaeans, though the Pechenegs would assume the bigger role in the events to come. While he moved around money and manpower from the east, which again was also undergoing its own issues with the Seljuks there, he dispatched his domesticos of the west, Georgios Pekorianos, quote, an excellent commander and skilled at drawing up his forces in battle formation and for free combat, end quote, writes Anna. And another exceptional soldier named Brannus accompanied Pekorianos. It seems that Alexius decided to throw his heavy hitters at the Pechenegs from the outset in order to achieve a quick victory and not have to pull resources away from Anatolia. As usually happens, there was a disagreement among the leadership in the field. See, Pekorianos believed a more patient strategy should be employed, as the Asian horse riders outnumbered them by far. Brannus, on the other hand, believed they should take advantage of a narrow passage and engage. Anna tells us that Pekorianos didn't want to be seen as a coward, so he changed his tune. Anna writes, quote, Pekorianos gave way to his impulsive colleague. Everyone was ordered to arm. When the preparations for battle were complete, they advanced against the Scythians, with Pekorianos at the center of the line. The Romans, vastly outnumbered and the sight of the enemy filled all of them with dread. Nevertheless, they attacked. Many were slain, and Brannus was mortally wounded. The domesticus, fighting furiously and charging the Scythians with great force, crashed into an oak tree and died on the spot. After that, the rest of the army dispersed in all directions. End quote.
This episode is brought to you by Nature's Bounty. Nature's Bounty believes your body is brilliant, naturally designed to thrive, inside and out. For those always looking for new ways to support your health from head to heels, Nature's Bounty has a range of over 400 vitamins and supplements born from 50 years of trust and care. Nature's Bounty. It's in your nature. Visit naturesbounty.com to learn more.
No one should have to choose between their own safety and their pets. But nearly half of domestic abuse survivors delay leaving because they can't bring their pets with them. Purina is helping to create more pet-friendly domestic violence shelters through the Purple Leash Project, so survivors and their pets can escape and heal together. Visit Purina.com/purple to learn more.
After this, Alexius mourned greatly for his longtime friend and brother-in-arms, Pekorianos, whom he'd known, fought beside, and loved as a brother since before he wore the crown. Pekorianos was now dead, along with this Brannus, two men who had seen to Alexius's accession to the throne, and it seemed a page was turned in Alexius's overall story. The emperor sent a man named Tatikios north of the capital to pay the remainder of the Roman army and to recruit others. While Tatikios was creating another army, Humbertopoulos, you may remember him, the Frenchman who had risen to quite a high level of prestige within the Byzantine military apparatus by the late 1080s, well, he led his contingent of the French cavalry to join Tatikios in the town of Kyzikos. Tatikios was feeling very good about things, especially since he'd have a hefty contingent of heavy cavalry to work with. So Tatikios marched north to meet the Pechenegs, pitching camp near Philippopolis. Before their camp could even be established, all their supplies and food still on the backs of their horses and pack animals, a rather large group of Pechenegs came into view. Both armies were shocked by the other's presence. The Romans merely wanted to entrench themselves before looking around the area, while the Pechenegs were returning from raids burdened by vast amounts of loot and prisoners. Tatikios wasted no time at all and sent a swift cavalry unit to pester the Pechenegs, and then soon followed it up with his main army, once he was given a few minutes to establish a formation. The Pechenegs quickly retreated, and the Romans found out that they just so happened to be quite close to the larger army of Pechenegs. The Romans, though, had the advantage of already being in battle array and armed to the teeth. Anna tells us that they, quote, divided into two and ordered to shout their war cry. The attack went in from either flank with tremendous yells and clamor. Most of the Scythians fell in the bitter fighting, but many saved their lives in scattered flight. Tatikios, with all their booty, returned triumphantly to Philippopolis, end quote. Though riding the high of victory, Tatikios knew that there was a seemingly endless supply of reinforcements for the Pecheneg army. They seemed never to have run out of people, and that they had only defeated one part of the whole. Tatikios ordered a large number of scouts to head out and report back with anything. He soon learned of an even larger force near the town of Beliatoba, and the lands around Beliatoba were being stripped bare as they spoke. And before he could act, Tatikios learned that the Pechenegs also knew of their presence around Philippopolis and were heading their direction. Crossing the Euros, emblazoned in his armor, Tatikios led his army toward the much larger Pecheneg force. It seemed, in all honesty, to be a death trap for the Romans. Tatikios, it said, was front and center of his army, and when they came within sight of the Pechenegs, both marching armies immediately halted. Anna admits that the Roman army found themselves awed by the sheer size of the enemy lines, but she says that the Pechenegs were struck with fear by the glimmering light cast off the Roman breastplates, so as to blind them to the actual size of the army. Many Romans were ready to fight, quote-unquote, Anna writes, sharpening teeth and sword alike. But Tatikios was smarter than that, and he ordered a complete halt, but to remain in battle formation for as long as necessary. Anna writes, quote, thus both sides stood firm, waiting for their adversaries to make the first move. No one was willing to break ranks and ride out, and by the time the sun went down, both had lost their advantage, and they retreated back to their camps for the night. Anna says this happened over the course of the next 2 days. On the fourth day, Tatikios realized the Pechenegs had retreated inexplicably, and he ordered a full chase. But after many hours, he realized it would be fruitless, as the Pechenegs were a much less heavy army and were able to move more quickly through the hills and mountain passes than his army was, which included foot soldiers and archers along with heavy and light cavalry units. That said, he ordered Humbertopolis to remain in the area of Philippopolis with his Frenchmen as a garrison. About half his army to disband, he also ordered, until they were needed again, and then he took the rest of the army back to Adrianopolis, just north of Constantinople. Smaller incursions by the Pechenegs were responded to over the course of 1088 and into 1089, being met by smaller Roman forces. Nothing major enough occurred to hit the records in any big way, but we know that there was an ongoing cat-and-mouse game being played by Pechenegs and Byzantines during this time. In the early spring of 1089, a Pecheneg warlord named Selgu amassed a force of up to 80,000 warriors. Okay, surely another one of Anna's exaggerations, but you get the point. And Selgu marched across the upper Danube Valley once again. Pechenegs, Sarmatians, and Dacians made up this stout force, and a Byzantine leader named Nicholas More responded in kind. They met near the village of Kuli. Moro broke his forces up into three and gave the order to attack. Surprisingly, even though the Byzantines were outnumbered by far, they somehow turned the engagement into a bloody rout, and before they knew it, the entire Pecheneg army began scattering in all directions. Well, it turns out this occurred precisely when their leader, Selgu, was mortally wounded. Anna tells us that the Pechenegs all seemed to be funneled down toward a crossing of the Skotinos River by the village of Kuli. And not only were many of them victims of being run over by their own men, but they also drowned, trying to escape through what Anna calls, quote-unquote, the mountain torrent. It was a tragic day for the Pechenegs, Sarmatians, and Dacians, but a monumental victory for the Byzantines, namely for their leader, Nicholas More and his men were rewarded generously by the emperor when they returned to Constantinople with news of this victory. With this, Alexius dispatched his own brother, Adrian Komnenos, to the west, as he took the place of the deceased Pekorianos as Domesticos of the West. This victory over the Pechenegs, however, did not deter them from pushing down the Danube, and Alexius heard word that they were once again terrorizing the lands in and around Philippopolis. Alexius decided it was now time for him to hit the fields, and pushed out of Constantinople with a heavy contingent making camp in the town of Lardaeus, just north of Adrianopolis. He spent 40 days in Lardaeus, organizing his forces and calling in all of his major leaders. Something had to be done about the Pechenegs, period. Small victories were not enough to dissuade this northern band. By the end of 40 days, Alexius had with him nearly every major military mind in the empire present in Lardaeus, including his brother Adrian, Domesticus of the West, who had to come all the way back, as well as Georgios Euphorbeinos, the blind but still brilliant Nicephorus Bryennius, yeah, remember him? Nicholas More Catacolon and his brother Gregory More Catacolon, Georgios Paleologos, the hero of Durazzo, and the two sons of Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, Nicephorus and Leo. All in all, Alexius was surrounded by experience, intelligence, and courage, all three hallmarks of a grand warrior. Hearing that the Pechenegs were encamped across the Hamo River valley, Alexius ordered his army forward, but the old and blind Nicephorus Bryennius warned against it, saying, quote, "I tell you this, my emperor, if you cross the Hamos, you will appreciate the fastest horses," end quote. In essence, be ready to ride like the wind if the battle turns sour. Georgios Euphorbeinos commanded a navy fleet on the river Ister, and he pushed his ships full of warriors toward the Pechenegs, who then noticed that big fleet. They were also aware that, simultaneously, Alexius himself was commanding the large Roman force by land, and they too were on their way. The Pechenegs knew full well they couldn't engage in both forces at the same time, so they sent 150 Pechenegs to negotiate peace, even offering Alexius up to 30,000 horse soldiers whenever he needed the help in far-off places. But Alexius knew, especially by now, come on, the history of it, Alexius knew he couldn't trust these Pechenegs as far as he could throw them. So he declined the meeting altogether. In Anna's words, quote, "The emperor saw through the Scythian fraud. Their embassy was an attempt to evade the imminent peril, and if they were granted a general amnesty, it would be a signal for the underlying spark of evil to be kindled into a mighty conflagration." He refused to hear the envoys. And around the time of this visit from the Pechenegs, a learned man, one of those diviners spoken about at the top of the show, well, he approached Alexius and whispered in his ear, quote unquote, "Just about this time, sir, you can expect an eclipse of the sun." Now, Alexius didn't believe him, of course, but Alexius knew an opening when he saw one. He immediately called those envoys back to him, and he decided to frame it this way. Quote, "The decision," he said, "I leave to God. If some sign should clearly be given in the sky within a few hours, then you will know for sure that I have a good reason to reject your embassy as suspect, because your leaders are not really negotiating for peace. If there is no sign, then I shall be proved wrong in my suspicions." End quote. Within 2 hours, the sun was blacked out. The whole world turned an eerie color of, well, as someone who was fortunate enough to recently experience a 99% solar eclipse just last year in April, the best I can describe the color, it's shade. In my own backyard, the greens were still green, the browns were still brown, the tans tan, the blues, but everything was muted in a way that the word shade still doesn't quite describe. The world took on a new meaning in those few minutes, a meaning masses of people throughout history have experienced, but one that still only a few have experienced fully. Applying my own experiences of the solar eclipse, I can imagine the scene 1,000 years ago when two armies stood across from each other and everything just became the color of shade. Everything became muted. And it was during these 3 or 4 minutes that the Pechenegs were, in the eyes of everyone present, revealed to be disingenuous in their pleas for peace. Alexios was apparently proven correct, and those 150 envoys were handed to Leo Nicarites, a widely respected eunuch, to chain them and march them to Constantinople as official prisoners of the crown. Well, unfortunately, Leo Nicarites and 2 other companions narrowly escaped when the 150 Pechenegs somehow fought their way free, murdering the other Roman guards over one night. The Pechenegs returned to their army, while Nicarites and his 2 companions, the survivors, returned to Alexios' side, informing him of the problem. The very next day, Alexios set up camp near a river that flows by the village of Dristra, but he was suddenly attacked without warning by a small contingent of Pechenegs and Manichaeans. Most of the enemy force was killed and captured, but some did escape. The imperial tent itself was in shambles afterwards due to the chaos that erupted from the raid, sending horses trampling tents, supplies, and men underfoot as they all panicked. He ordered a quick cleanup and a reorganization of his forces, giving the panicked soldiers a chance to catch their breaths, but soon ordered them in full battle array. They were marching on Dristra itself, as that was the place his scouts said the main Pecheneg army was at. We learned that a Pecheneg leader named Tatu had slipped out of the village during the previous week and was seeking help from nearby Cumans, which was terrible news for Alexios, actually. Georgios Palaiologos and Gregory Morkatakalon both argued vigorously for Alexios to move the army to a nearby city called Great Perslava, or Preslav as it's known today, which was a symbolic city to the natives of the area and recognized as such by these Pechenegs. Perslava was the original capital of the formerly great Bulgar Empire, but was at the time, 1090, to be another strategic city along the Danube. Palaiologos and Morkatakalon argued that this was already a fortified city and had the geography that would work to their advantage if used as a base of operations. Even in a siege, Perslava was better than just about anything in the region. Alexios agreed. But battle was inevitable at this point. Alexios ordered his entire army not to light a single fire or lamp that night. And before catching a quick sleep, they were to have their horses equipped and ready. At dawn, they must be in formation and ready for battle. The next morning, as the sun rose, Pechenegs were humbled by the sight of the gleaming armor already in battle array. Alexios Komnenos was leading the center himself. On his right were 2 men whom he'd trusted fully, a man named Castamonites and the recent hero, Tatikios. On Alexios' left was none other than his brother-in-law and old rival for the throne, Nicephorus Melissenos. As for Alexios himself, Anna writes, quote, 6 men were picked out by the emperor to act as personal bodyguard. They were told to watch him and pay attention to nobody else at all. The men chosen were Romanos Diogenes' 2 sons, Nicholas Morkatakalon, who had long and varied experience in war, Ioannikos, Neampetes, the commander of the Varangians, and a certain Gulis, who was a retainer of the family. End quote. So it was that on the next day, between early morning until late afternoon, fighting occurred. It must have been brutal, as massive casualties were suffered on both sides. Somewhere in the beginning, we learn that one of Alexios' personal bodyguards ventured a bit too far away from his emperor and was caught up in the melee. It was Leo, Romanos Diogenes' son, and he was killed that day fighting for Alexios. We also read of another bit of daring by Adrian Komnenos, Alexios' little brother and new domesticus of the West, who pierced the lines of the Pechenegs until he reached the wagons that the Pechenegs were using as ramparts from which to fire arrows a little farther. Only 7 of his men rode back to Alexios' side with him. And during this same battle, we learn about Georgios Palaiologos being unhorsed, Pechenegs rushing toward him with murderous intent. Just then, seemingly out of nowhere, Bishop Leo of Chalcedon rode up and jumped off his own horse. Palaeologos, without thinking, jumped upon it when the bishop handed him the reins, and he rode off. No one ever saw the good bishop again. It was an even struggle all day long, with neither side gaining an advantage, but as the sun was nearing the western horizon, thousands of horse riders, Anna says 36,000, but, well, you get it by now, appeared behind the Pecheneg lines. Alexios knew he couldn't hold out against a force with such reinforcements just now appearing. But while the Romans began to back away collectively, Alexios, it seems, wasn't quite finished fighting. Holding his sword in his right hand and an amaphorion in the other, he remained with around 20 of his closest friends and brothers-in-arms, including the personal bodyguards. The amaphorion is an interesting detail, so I did a little digging. The amaphorion is a vestment, much like the Catholic pallium. It's a strip of fabric used to symbolize a bishop's rightful place as the shepherd of his flock, a symbol that his people should trust him. Other than the 20 individuals staying at his side, this doesn't seem to be the case for Alexios, because his army was slowly backing away, leaving he and his circle exposed in the center. The circle had the likes of Diogenes' other son, Nicephorus, and Irene Doukaina's own brother, Michael Doukas, among others. Quote-unquote, all brave men, writes Anna. Anna continues with another rousing story of her heroic father. Quote, 3 Scythian foot soldiers leapt upon them. 2 seized his horse's bit, 1 on either side. The third grabbed him by the right leg. Alexios immediately cut off the hand of one, and raising his sword and roaring loudly, put him to flight. The man who was clinging to his leg, he struck on the helmet. He only struck him rather lightly, however, rather than with the full force, since he feared one of 2 things would happen if he hit him too hard. Either he might strike his own foot, or he might hit his own horse, with the result that he would then be captured by the enemy. He delivered a second blow, but this time took careful aim. In all his deeds and words and movements, Alexios let reason be his guide. He was never carried away by anger or swept off his feet by passion. At the first blow, the Scythian's helmet had been thrust backwards, and he now struck at the man's bare head. In a second, he was laying on the ground, without having had a chance to utter a cry. The clangs of swords and cries of men like a deafening, near-constant wind in his ears. Alexios just barely hears Michael Doukas, no doubt out of breath and screaming himself, that the Romans had retreated. The field was lost, and that he, the emperor, should absolutely get the hell out of there. The 2 men in the midst of hand-to-hand combat had a tense verbal exchange, shall we say, and looking around at the devastation and death, the situation became clear to Alexios. Michael was right. Quote, as Anna writes, when your death involves danger for everybody else, why not choose the better course? If you are saved, you will make war again and win. End quote. Mounted still, most of the 20 men were still alive and fighting. Alexios shouted his orders, and each man fell in line with their emperor, riding through the thick lines of Pechenegs toward safety. But as we know, when Alexios escapes, he rarely gets out without a fuss. He was chased, and we hear that he was attacked time and time again, coming out victorious each one, though one of the enemy actually stabbed him in the butt, which actually caused Alexios endless pain going forward for the rest of his life. While this was occurring, Georgius Palaeologos, on the Bishop Chalcedon's horse that is, rode upon a group of about 150 Roman cavalrymen who were nearly surrounded by a much larger force of Pechenegs. He promised these men that if they all took oaths to burst through the enemy lines as one, then they would survive, but not a single one of them could go into it weakly. They agreed, and Palaeologos led the charge forward, but as war does with any of us, many men's fears got the better of them, and only a select few actually broke free. Palaeologos, however, though he made it through, he found himself once again alone. Anna writes that for 11 days Palaeologos wandered, before eventually being found by a local widow and her sons, who were also at the battle. He rested and returned to Alexios' side shortly thereafter. After recollecting his forces, Alexios was able to take stock in what was left after the devastating loss to the Pechenegs. Leo Diogenes was dead. Georgios Palaiologos was missing. Nicephorus Melissenos was a Pecheneg prisoner, and the emperor had a serious pain in the backside. No pun intended. Okay, a little pun intended. As Melissenos played the role of mediator in his own ransom negotiations, things were settled and Alexios was able to buy most prisoners back, Nicephorus Melissenos certainly among them. At this point, if you remember, Tatu, the Pecheneg leader who had left to recruit the Cumans against Eastern Rome, well, Tatu, he arrived at the head of thousands more Cumans. The problem was that the fighting had already happened. They were late to the party. Everyone was gone, and the Pechenegs owned all the booty. But Cumans demanded a cut, saying that they left their homes and their families and traveled all the way there. It's like, fine, you can keep most of it, but we at least should be compensated some gas money for our efforts. It's the thought that counts, right? But naturally, the Pechenegs wouldn't have any of that. This, of course, resulted in a rather large battle between the Pechenegs and the Cumans. We know next to nothing about this battle, except that it certainly occurred. And let's just say that the Cumans didn't go home empty-handed, and the Pechenegs were quite a bit worse for the wear afterward. But the fight was hardly finished. The Pecheneg problem was ever present heading into the 1090s. Until next time.